We're now beginning our work on Chapter 7, and let's think about where we've been. So the key perspectives that we've examined so far include the psychoanalytic. We talked about Freud and all those unconscious drives and libido motivations. We talked about the neo-analytic, that is, we added the dimension of social interactions and the seeking of self to explain our systematic behaviors that we call personality. We looked at a behaviorist perspective, considering that personality is created through contingencies or rewards and punishers that are imposed upon us and eventually integrated into our systematic behaviors. We talked about biology, the aspect of how genetic, physiological, and biological characteristics contribute to our systematic behaviors. And now we're talking about cognitive, and we're going to think about how personality is created through our patterns of thought, through our repeated patterns of thought. So this is an overview of these cognitive perspectives, which consider the lens that we are, our personalities are, what we think, the thoughts that we allow into our minds, the choices we make about where to place our attention, the repeated thoughts that we choose to focus on rather than abandon. We are what we think. So what we'll be considering in this content is an idea of Gestalt, and we'll talk about what this is. So cognitive theories rest on Gestalt theories, or the recognition that when our minds fill in gaps when we face incomplete information. So we never have complete information. Our mind is always filling in gaps. Even as you look around you right now, you'll see that there are some things that are behind other things, preventing your senses from perceiving what is actually there, and yet your mind fills in the blanks and lets you know, oh, that's a chair. I know it's a chair, and I know it has legs, even though the legs are underneath the table. That's the idea, a bit of an idea of Gestalt. So all of reality is incomplete and subject to interpretation. So how does your mind fill in the blanks? Is it different from mine? Interpretations are based on sensing, and by this we just mean using our senses, eyes, ears, nose, etc. Filtering, pushing aside irrelevant information, perceiving, and responding. Our cognitive styles then are the habits with which we interpret information. So each of us organizes the information in the world around us differently. These categories matter, and we'll see that at the end when we look with the role construct repertory. We all place different levels of importance on what our senses take in and what we perceive. So the salience of it is impacted by our thoughts and impacts our thoughts. We control our attention differently. And we differ in the cognitive complexity we can handle. So how many details are we capable of taking in and processing at one time? And we differ in the lens that we apply. For example, optimism is a characteristic that we'll talk about as an explanatory style within this cluster of material. A little bit more on Gestalt. So Gestalt is a pattern or configuration that is subject to interpretation. You can see this image in the lower left of the screen. If you look at it from one perspective, you might see 8 black dots. If you look at it from another perspective, you might see a 3-dimensional box. If you look at it from yet another perspective, you might see a piece of paper with holes half popped out of it. And on top of a box. And so there are a lot of different ways of seeing this image, and our mind looking at this ambiguous image has to make sense of it. And how do we do that? Well, our mind completes the blanks for us. In something like this, you might even be able to notice your perceptions switching back and forth between seeing the box and seeing the dots, or seeing the hole in the paper in front of the box. A lot of times this happens. So your mind fills in the blanks, and none of those are there. There are no complete black dots on the paper. Your mind's filling that information in. There is no cube on the paper. Your mind's filling that in as well. So this is the process of Gestalt. So we know, for example, that there is sky behind these buildings, and that these buildings are three-dimensional and deep enough for someone to go into, even though they look like walls. We seek meaning in our environment through our senses. And again, when we say sensing in psychology, we just mean our actual senses: eyes, ears, touch, smell, sight, sound, and taste. Sometimes we consider our intuitive processes to be included in this. We organize our sense information or our sensation into perceptions, giving them meaning. And the whole is greater than the sum of its parts and can't be reduced. So this building is made up of whatever features that the building has in it, many, many features. And if we would not, the parts that went into it before they made the building were less than the building itself. We can't take it apart again. And this cookie is a good example of that. This cookie is made up of flour and sugar and butter and eggs and chocolate chips and a couple other ingredients, but the cookie is more than that. If we gave you all those ingredients and lined them up in front of you, you would not eat it. But mixed up, baked, and so forth, it's a cookie. The Gestalt, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And likewise, we consider that we humans, if we look at the elements and in our body, we know what our body is made up of, and yet we consider that the individual, even if we took all of those things in those exact proportions, we knew that as a human being, we would have a greater individual than just the sum of all those ingredients. So just a little bit more, we'll look at Broadbent's simple model of attention, again, because that is the foundation of cognitive theory. So we sense stimuli with our 5 senses and our other inputs. So there's that word sensing again. We also sense through internal bodily processes like digestion or heart rate. So your internal, your autonomic systems also sense information and will tighten or cease digestion or respond to those experiences. And our thoughts also give us input. So we sense stimuli also because of our thoughts. And so a neutral situation, if we impose on it a series of negative thoughts, then we have influenced the situation. So we filter the information that we attend to, both consciously and unconsciously. So the filters that are present for me, the things that I don't notice and do notice, are different than the filters that are present for most of you and for everybody else individually, each of us. For example, we automatically process things like the squeaky wheel gets the grease, like we tend to notice this blue ball first. Okay, so those are automatic kinds of processes. We notice this unusual vehicle, it's different, we notice what's different, we notice what's novel. And that happens automatically. It draws our attention. We can then interfere with that with conscious effort. So if we injure ourselves, our attention will be drawn to this injury, but our attention is this powerful tool that we have, and we can place our attention elsewhere. We can divert ourselves by focusing on something else, and then the experience won't be as bad. So just an example in this situation with all the different things that are going on, everyone's attention, you can even see, is focused on something a little bit different, and that's a choice that we have. So then we perceive things, we give meaning to the things that we've given our attention to, and we interpret them through our cognition, through our thoughts. So the meaning might be based in things that we've learned, so we infer things about it through our conscious processes, or the meaning may be emotional, based in conditioned emotional responses, like the kinds of things that we talked about in our behaviorist chapter. And then we respond and react to the information on which we have focused attention with some sort of action. Like maybe we store it in memory, or maybe we learn that that's a bad thing, stay away, or that's a good thing, approach. Maybe we take a physical action in responding. So in this chapter, we'll talk about a range of cognitive styles. We'll talk about field theory with Kurt Lewin. He's considered the father of psychology very often. We'll talk about field dependence and field independence. We'll talk about constructs in the role construct repertory. That's Kelly's work, and you'll be doing that activity. We'll talk about explanatory style, optimistic and pessimistic explanatory styles with Seligman and also Dr. Talay-Charot. We'll talk about locus of control, Rotter's work, and attributions, Heider's work, self-efficacy, Bandura's work. We'll talk about cognitive distortions with Beck, growth and fixed mindset with Dweck, and these are capitalized because these are in red text because this is not dealt with deeply in your book. And then there's a little bit in your book that we're not talking much about, so pay attention in your reading to social cognitive theories, to self-regulation, and to ADHD. So we're ready to begin. Let's get started.